Thank you, Pamela. Can you hear me okay? All right. I have to do technology now, so watch out. I assume you can read that. And I assume you know what this is. This is not a trick. I just wanted to get started, especially with the dates of its beginning and dedication. And remind you, if you didn't already know this, that for the last 22 years, I was the moderator and occasional speaker and one-time heckler at the San Jacinto Symposium. I was a speaker at the first year. I came the second year and heckled Steve Harden and other people. So they made me moderator for life to keep me out of the audience. I'm going to mention a number of people tonight who we had as guest speakers at the San Jacinto Symposium. And I must say I really enjoyed very, very much being associated with the San Jacinto Battleground Conservancy, the San Jacinto Museum and Monument, and all the other people who had anything to do ever at all with the San Jacinto Symposium. There will be another one, without me this time, in April. What does that monument you were just looking at mean? That is, what does it mean to most people? To most people, it means two things. One, this was the inflection point. This was the moment of decision wherein history took a turn that wasn't by that time expected. This is when everything changed depending on what happened in that battle. And what happened in that battle is often very surprising to people who realized just what the Texans were up against in facing the oncoming Mexican army. That's one of the things it means. And this plaque around, one of the many around the monument, says it best in its first two sentences, which they've arranged for me to be so low I can't read. But you can see there that measured against its results, this was a big deal. And according to this interpretation, what followed naturally with the annexation of Texas and the Mexican War was that a third of this area of the United States was added. So this was a big deal. This was an inflection point. This right here was where everything changed. Now, I must admit that at my first San Jacinto Symposium, I told them they put the monument in the wrong place. I will explain, but it'll take a few minutes. The other thing that this monument means for most Texans, since it is the tallest war monument in the world still, is that we did it. We did it ourselves. We did it without help from foreign countries. Bunch of farmers and lawyers defeated the Mexican army, ran them out of Texas, established our independence, and that gave the Republic of Texas a certain cachet, as they say, a certain sense of themselves that's still a part of the Texan identity. And it was there very much in the Texas Republic, and it has not completely faded away. But there's another monument. This photograph was almost certainly taken by Lewis Wilts Kemp, one of the men most responsible for the establishment of this monument. It's out west of here in Fort Bend County. Clarence Wharton, lawyer and amateur historian, was talking to Joseph Darst. Anyone know who Joseph Darst was? Anyone out there? It's not a familiar name. He was the landowner where they're standing. Now, why am I going to suggest that maybe the monument should have been in Fort Bend County if it really is where things changed for good and in a way that was never reversed? You see the label up there pointing to a place in Fort Bend County? Mrs. Powell's Place, often called Mrs. Powell's Tavern. Here's the monument that's there. As I told the people at the first San Jacinto Symposium, the monument that stands, well, lies where I thought the monument ought to be is only 6 inches tall. Why? Because the cattle on the Darst place knocked it over. Now here's what it says. Site of the home of Elizabeth Powell, built before March 20th, 1831, when the land was granted to her, period. They used asterisk for period for technical reasons I don't understand. This point marked the most eastern advance of Urrea's army and the most southern advance of Santa Anna, who turned east from here to the Brazos and San Jacinto. Here the Mexican army encamped after the Battle of San Jacinto. Now, what's the most important sentence of those three? Sorry? It's the last one. That's the most important sentence. But why? So what? So they encamped there after San Jacinto. It was all over after San Jacinto, right? San Jacinto is the inflection point. San Jacinto is when the decision was made by history that things were going to go in a different direction. By the way, I put this in just to reassure some of you that it's not on its back anymore. It's been reestablished and strengthened against the cattle as of 2010, and now the monument is back up like it ought to be. Now, this was an eyewitness to that meeting in 1836 after the Battle of San Jacinto. José Enrique de la Peña wrote a memoir based on the diary he kept during the Revolution. He was at the Alamo. He wasn't at San Jacinto, but he was close by. And he told us what happened when the Mexican army encamped there. This manuscript that he left behind, he died before he completely rewrote it, went unpublished for 120 years, till it finally came out in the 1950s in Mexico City, edited by someone called here, J. or J. Sanchez Garza. Keep that name in mind. It'll be important in just a minute. Almost no Texas historian paid any attention to this book when it came out. Hadn't been translated into English yet. Lon Tinkle is a very famous Texas historian, and many of you have probably read or are familiar with 13 Days to Glory, his story of the siege of the Alamo. Tinkle said he had noticed the book, that it was very important, but he got the name of the author completely wrong. He called him González Peña instead of José Enrique de la Peña. I don't think Lon Tinkle actually read the book. I think he heard about it, stuck it in a footnote, but he didn't notice the time bomb that was there in that manuscript and therefore in that book published in Mexico City. What's the time bomb? This. This is De la Peña's account of the capture and execution of David Crockett. And he's not the only eyewitness. Santa Anna's personal secretary, Ramon Martinez Caro, was another eyewitness. This was the time bomb that no one noticed until this book came out, the English translation, translated, edited by Carmen Perry, once a director of the Daughters of the Republic of Texas Library, the Alamo. And when English-speaking Texans read this account of David Crockett being captured and executed rather than dying in combat, the proverbial manure hit the fan. Carmen Perry got hate mail, midnight phone calls, harassment. Well, someone decided to come to her rescue. This guy. Ever hear of Dan Kilgore? Kilgore was the president of the Texas State Historical Association, who had to give a speech in 1977. And he decided, as he was thinking about this speech he was going to have to give, that he would go over all the relevant documentation of how Davy Crockett died, including De La Peña's account. That's the book. How did Davy die? He didn't just get midnight phone calls. He got virtual death threats. He got called a communist and a smut peddler. He was chewed out on the radio. Dan, whom I only met once, briefly in about 1995 or 96, in the book exhibit at the TSHA convention, Dan said he wouldn't have minded so much if people had just bought and read the damn book. But they didn't. He didn't make much money at all on it. And most of the people, the great majority of people who criticized the book, did not read it. They just heard what people said about it, and it became a kind of ongoing avalanche or snowball of anger about what Dan said about how Davy Crockett died. By the way, I was asked to do a 30th anniversary edition of this book. They asked me to write an afterword. I got carried away. The afterword is longer than the book. So I'm now a co-author with a man I only met once. But what I did in this book, although, you know what I learned when I published my first book? That authors don't get to decide what the title is, and authors don't get to decide what goes on the cover. That's the publisher. So that's not my title, that's the publisher's title. Here's what I did in that book. I told in the first third what happened to Dan. This turning his life upside down because of what he had written. In the second part, I critique his argument. I think he was right, but his argument had flaws. You'll find out what they were if you read the book. The third part is where I talk about the two things that Dan didn't want to talk about when he wrote this book: race and myth. He eventually made his peace with myth. Dan decided before he died something that's absolutely true, that the mythic Davy Crockett is more historically important than the actual Davy Crockett. Because what we think about the past is more important than what actually happened in the past. It affects our lives more than what actually happened in the past very often. And Dan had a while to get to that point. The thing he never wanted to talk about was race. And that is, here you've got a Mexican lieutenant colonel talking about how Davy Crockett, the Texan and American hero, died. Dan Rather once told the New York Times that no one should ever believe what a Mexican soldier said about a Texan hero. That's not the only mistake that Dan Rather made. It's the only one I'll mention. One of the people who was really upset by what Carmen Perry had translated and what Dan Kilgore had written about how Davy Crockett died was this man, Bill Groneman, a New York City arson investigator, fireman. He was there at 9/11. I talked to him a few days afterwards. He escaped with his life, but just barely. He came in, worked out of a building for 3 days that fell down on the fourth day. Bill Groneman didn't like the idea that you've destroyed a legend with this document that he claimed was a forgery. I first met Bill Groneman here. Who can tell me what that is? It's the old DRT library at the Alamo. That DRT library has now moved twice, first to Texas A&M San Antonio and now to the Bexar County Courthouse. But this is where I met Bill Groneman as he was introducing the world to his book, Defense of a Legend, defending Crockett against the accusations made by the De La Pena diary. Bill came in. I had just finished an article about Herman Ehrenberg, in which I was able to prove that a nasty, racist, I don't just use that word loosely, anti-Mexican, anti-Indian speech attributed to Sam Houston was not written by Sam Houston. I knew it the moment I read the speech. Houston was a naturalized Cherokee who spoke the language. He's not going to write an anti-Indian speech. And he was very friendly with people named Seguin, as I am today. And that's just not Houston. It was actually written by a young German by the name of Herman Ehrenberg. So I had just published this article made up of my detective work about the Sam Houston speech, the so-called Sam Houston speech. Groneman was in, showing this book. I had heard about the book. I bought it. He signed it. The artist who designed the cover signed it. I took it home to read it. And I was troubled by it because he hadn't proved his point. And about this time, because I was a detective now, the Texas State Historical Association's journal, the Southwestern Historical Quarterly, asked me to review Groneman's book. When they first asked me, I thought, okay, it'll probably be a short, favorable review. After all, he had a picture of the guy he said did the forgery. This is the other detective, besides Groneman. Someone recognized me in that. My department head, a famous Lincoln scholar by the name of William Harris, told me he put this picture up on his wall in the kitchen to scare away cockroaches. But that's what I looked like about the time I wrote this article. Now, when they gave me this book review assignment, it started metastasizing very quickly as I realized that I was going to have to counter Groneman's argument and not just say this was a bad book or a good book. The first thing I noticed, one of the first things, remember J. Sanchez Garza? Well, Carmen Perry, his translator, called him Jose. Bill Groneman, the New York City fireman, called him Jesus. How would I know what the answer was? Well, I looked it up. Where? Here. This is a formidable catalog. This is the National Union catalog of pre-1956 imprints. This is not great bedtime reading. Each page is made up of 12 library cards. Remember the old library cards before you had computers? Had to flip through those drawers? Well, that's what this is. Library card after library card. So who do you think was right? The fireman or the professional editor? The fireman. It was Jesus. This is the other thing I found in the National Union catalog. I let my eyes go from the bottom of the page up to the top, and I saw that there was not only the 1955 memoir, there was also this little document from 1839. One of a kind. Only one copy known to exist in Mexico or the United States. This was brought from Latin America by Hiram Bingham to Yale. Who was Hiram Bingham? The man who discovered for Anglos Machu Picchu in Peru. So Hiram Bingham brings back this document in a big stack that stayed in a big stack for a very long time. It was written, as the sign says here, from cell number 11 of the Inquisition prison. De la Peña, following the Texas Revolution in Mexican politics, zigged when he should have zagged and ended up in prison. So he writes this pamphlet begging to be released, and he says, among other things, that I've almost finished the memoir based on my diary. Casi finito, almost finished. This is important because what Groneman had argued is that there was material in the diary, so-called, from 1838, and everyone said the diary had been published in 1836. In fact, Walter Lord, as in A Time to Stand, a book on the Alamo, said that it had been published in 1836. John Jenkins, the great Texas bibliographer, said it had been published in 1836. It had not. It was not published until the 20th century. There was no first edition from 1836. So there was no contradiction, no anachronism between the diary as written and the diaries understood in the 20th century. The other thing about this little document, only 16 pages long, is that as he talks about what happened to Mexico and the Mexican army, he uses language which is verbatim the same language as in the manuscripts that I showed you before, as in the Davy Crockett page. There are over 500 manuscript pages. There's the diary, there's the memoir based on it, there are his list of footnotes that he scratches out once he puts the footnotes in. He didn't quite finish. He died or got separated from the manuscript before he finished. What I found in there were 5 legal-sized pages that he had written about the last part of his trip across South Texas, all the way from the Nueces to Matamoros. That had never been published in Spanish. It had never been published in English. And so we brought out a new edition, which I got to write the introduction for, and which included this new section, which I called La Semana Perdida, the lost week, the week that De la Peña had written about, but had never been published. Now, who was really interested in that new edition and really interested in De la Peña? Anybody know this guy? He's now a retired pediatrician. He was a working pediatrician when I worked with him, but he was also a working metal detector. Greg Dimmick noticed, I guess I should say, that people were finding cannonballs all over Wharton County. What battle took place in Wharton County? None. 0. And he bought himself a metal detector and started metal detecting. And he found the mother lode. What happened? And why was he so interested in De la Peña's account? The first time Greg and I visited Mrs. Powell's place and saw this monument over on its side, we were digging around. They let us have a few shovelfuls to just see what was there. A lot. Crockery, metal parts, bricks, lots of stuff which showed us, yes, this is where Mrs. Powell's place had been. Why do I use the past tense? You'll see in a moment. Who was at Mrs. Powell's place? This is General Urrea. Never lost a battle in the Texas Revolution. When the word came that there had been a disaster here at San Jacinto, he was ticked. It stopped him in the middle of his tracks as he was about to reach the Texas coast and capture yet another city. And he had to go back and meet other Mexican generals at Mrs. Powell's place. He wrote in anger, "We ought to at least try to find his ashes," referring to Santa Anna, because they didn't know what had happened to Santa Anna. How many of you thought that Santa Anna is the one responsible for the Mexican retreat? No. They started retreating before they knew Santa Anna was alive or dead. The other general there, and the general in command, who had been the second in command for Santa Anna, was Vicente Filasola. De la Peña loved Urrea. He hated Filasola. He thought Urrea ought to get the Mexican army together and head for San Jacinto. Filasola didn't do that. When I said De la Peña hated Filasola, I guess I should elaborate. I'm going to use some profanity, but it's Spanish, so it won't bother you quite so much. Tornel was the Mexican Minister of War, and De la Peña said, "Tornel es un carajo." I won't tell you what carajo means, you have to look it up. He said, "Santa Anna is a carajote." That's a very big carajo. And he said, Filasola, who was the third level of bad, es un Italiano, an Italian. He wasn't a real Mexican. He didn't care about the Mexican national territory. He was willing to give it up. And what Filasola decided to do at this meeting at Mrs. Powell's place was to fall back to the Colorado River and wait for the Mexican government to send instructions. This is what De la Peña wrote as they left Mrs. Powell's place. Not going east toward San Jacinto, as De la Peña wanted them to do, and as Urrea really wanted them to do, but back west towards the Colorado as Filasola ordered. What would have happened if they had gone east? One of the San Jacinto Symposia that we had invited archaeologists who had studied the NRG property near here. It had never been metal detected. What do you think they found there? They found a long, straight line of weapons where Colonel Juan Almonte had had his troops gather together, drop their weapons, and march together towards the Texans to surrender, with him, who spoke English, holding his sword out and surrendering. This saved hundreds of Mexican lives. But what did Sam Houston think when he saw those guys coming? We're screwed. Here comes the Mexican army. My army is already starting to disband, and they were really disbanding within a day or two of the battle. And had Filasola managed to get over there to here, not there, but here, it might have turned out very different. So what was the inflection point? What was the point of no return? It's when the Mexican army, not knowing whether Santa Anna is alive or dead, goes west instead of coming here east and routing Houston's army. Now, one of the reasons that Greg Dimmick was so interested in what De la Peña had said and what the Mexican army had done, especially after he had found all this stuff, was using archaeological evidence not only to show what the Mexican army had done. What they had done was to march west just as it started raining. They crossed the San Bernard River. They were getting stuck. They said, uh-oh, we better go back across and go another way. Take the road to San Felipe. They couldn't. They crossed it going west. They couldn't recross going east. They had to go north where they were and try to head some of those rivers. They got stuck completely in the mud. This is the book that Greg Dimmick wrote about El Mar de Lodo, the Sea of Mud. Here's what De la Peña wrote. You can read that, I believe. Men are dying, mules are dying, cannons are left behind, cannonballs are left behind, ammunition's left behind, weapons are left behind, everything's in the mud. By the time they got to the Colorado, after days and days of struggling in the mud, the Mexican army was incapable of fighting the Texans, even if they had tried. Going west was a disaster for the Mexican army. Now, why did Filosola tell the Mexican government that he had done this? Sort of like me when I didn't turn in my assignments in 4th grade. You know, he didn't say that the cat ate it, which I did, but he said it was too far, and he exaggerated by 100% the distance he would have had to go to get to San Jacinto. He also said, Texas is a desolate country. We couldn't feed the army. Well, parts of Texas are a desolate country. Not Fort Bend, not Harris, not these places. Santa Anna was burning very wealthy plantations as he moved along that were obviously full of victuals and cattle, and it wasn't a desolate country. But finally he said something that was sort of true. I couldn't be resupplied by sea. Why couldn't he be resupplied by sea? This guy knows. John Jordan's another guest we had at the San Jacinto Symposium. He's a practicing lawyer in Atlanta, but in the 10 years he spent here in Houston as a lawyer, he studied the Texas Navy. The Texas Navy, which even early in the Revolution had begun to pick off Mexican ships and keep the Mexicans from being able to resupply their army either at Copano or at Galveston Bay or at Matagorda. The Mexicans were stymied. The other thing Jonathan Jordan says is that the United States of America and its citizens were extremely important in fitting out and supplying the Texas Navy. They gave them credit, they gave them cash, they let them register their ships, they used American registered ships to bring guns and ammunition. Where were they bringing them from? New Orleans. New Orleans was deeply embedded into the Texas Revolution. And Jonathan Jordan makes a very good case that it was the Texas Navy, as much as anything else, which helped win the Texas Revolution by preventing the Mexicans from being resupplied by sea. Here's someone else who believes the United States was very deeply involved. Another one of our guests at the San Jacinto Symposium, a leading professor at the College of Mexico, Josefina Zoraida Vasquez. She is a very prominent, or was, a very prominent Mexican historian. As you can see, she's written histories of Mexico. This is what she thought of both the war with Mexico in the United States and the Texas Revolution. The intervention, the North American intervention. She used that phrase not only to describe the war with the United States, but also the Texas Revolution. She said the Americans were up to their eyebrows in fomenting and supporting the Texas Revolution with money, with men, with arms, with credit, with everything that was necessary. Here's someone who agrees with her. Ed Miller was a school administrator in San Antonio. Before Katrina, he went to New Orleans and excavated, literally, the history of New Orleans and the Texas Revolution. The most amazing thing he discovered were piles and piles and piles of records from notaries public. There were notary public records from that period in New Orleans, hundreds of them, which showed all of these transfers of money and supplies and equipment and support from New Orleans to people interested in the Texas Revolution. He came to the conclusion, and he's no liberal weirdo, that the commercial interest in New Orleans had more to do with the direction of the Texas Revolution than anyone in Texas. By the way, just off the top of your head, who was the most important American agent, that is, agent of the United States in Texas? He was here, where I stand. His name was Sam Houston. Houston was sent to Texas by Andrew Jackson. And after he looked over Texas, he crossed back over into Louisiana and wrote Jackson a letter and said, I'm going to go live in Texas, and I'm going to do everything within my power to make sure the United States gains control of Texas. Who was the leading British agent in Texas and Mexico? Probably a man named James Grant. One of his descendants, Stuart Reed, has written a book called The Secret War for Texas, about the fight between the British trying to keep Texas either independent or part of Mexico, and the Americans and Sam Houston trying to get Texas to be part of the United States. Here are two more people that we had as guests at the San Jacinto Symposium. A married couple from Corpus Christi, amateur historians, Bill and Marjorie Walraven. This is a great little book they put together, many essays. They were really interested in 200 bayonets. What 200 bayonets? The ones that were spotted at the Battle of San Jacinto. What did they do? They went to Fort Jessup, or the records from Fort Jessup, and looked at the list of deserters from the United States Army fort in Louisiana, and compared those names to men who fought at San Jacinto and to men who came to Texas at that time. And they found an enormous overlap. So many people now believe, sincerely and probably accurately, that deserters from the United States bringing their weapons, including farmers in Texas don't use bayonets, to plant their crops or whatever you're going to do with a bayonet. But a lot of people believe that there were as many as 200 American Army deserters fighting here at San Jacinto. So many people believe this that they're selling little soldiers that you can put in your diorama of San Jacinto.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, sir.
So Sam Houston, was he key in trying to obtain those men? Because he was so short-handed.
Sam Houston was, I'll explain that as I go along.
Okay.
Sam Houston was desperate, and he was disappearing from time to time and writing lots of letters to Fort Jessup and to the United States generally, to governors in the United States like Louisiana and Arkansas. What county is this? This is Nacogdoches, not far from Fort Jessup. Here's a little known fact. What army was occupying Nacogdoches in the middle of 1836? And I don't mean deserters. The United States Army was occupying Nacogdoches in the middle of 1836. Was Josefina Vasquez right that the Americans are up to their eyebrows in the Texas Revolution? Well, yes, of course. Now, the excuse was, and it's one that Houston gave to answer your question, that there was a danger of Indian warfare. And so the excuse was, we've moved across the border in order to protect people from the Indians. The Indians weren't the problem. Here's something else that came through Nacogdoches. This is the flag of the New Orleans Greys. Two companies, one came by land, one by sea. They fought especially hard at the Siege of Bayeux. the capture of San Antonio in December of 1835. One of those guys, when he was a teenager, he wasn't a teenager when this picture was taken, was Hermann Ehrenberg, the person I've been writing about for about 30 years now. This picture was taken in New York City in 1860. It was only discovered in 2016, 200 years after his birth, at a thrift shop in Manhattan, and was bought for $30. It's the only known photograph of Hermann Ehrenberg. He took after fighting in the Texas Revolution and living here in Houston, he went back to Europe, wrote his memoir in German. This is it, Texas und seine Revolution. And it says under his name there, Bürger der Republik, citizen of the Republic, meaning citizen of the Republic of Texas. The first translation of this in any kind of book form was in 1935. The problem was it was rigorously censored with all the sex, drugs, and rock and roll taken out, literally. And with a lot of things that would have allowed people to identify that so-called Houston speech as really being written by Ehrenberg. This book was so drastically censored by its publisher that Henry Nash Smith, who had edited under the name of Henry Smith, wrote it out of his resume, told his friends to never mention the book again. I interviewed one of them when he was in his 90s. He was terribly embarrassed by the book. Who was Henry Nash Smith? If you ever take a course on the American West, you've got to know that. He wrote Virgin Land, the American West as Symbol and Myth. He was one of the founders of the American Studies movement. He ended his career as editor of the Mark Twain papers and as chairman of the English department at Berkeley and president of the Modern Language Association. He was a big deal. And when I talked to his wife after his death, she never knew about this book. He had kept it hidden from his colleagues and his family. The second editor of Hermann Ehrenberg's memoir was me. From the time I started working on it till the time this book came out in 2021 was 29 years. And I retired in 2017 so I could finish the book. I wrote every day or so for 4.5 years. And as I told someone last night, I loved every minute of it. It was fun. One of the things that makes it challenging as well as fun is that Ehrenberg lies a lot. He makes up stories. He was there at the Siege of Bayeux, and he's a good witness. He was there at the Goliad massacre, which he survived. The people on either side of him were shot and killed. He barely survived. That photograph I showed you earlier, and if you buy the book, you'll see it, has a scar across his forehead that he got when he pushed through a Mexican lieutenant, got a sword across the forehead as he made it to the San Antonio River and escaped, along with 27 other men eventually, from the Goliad massacre, where 400 men, virtually, were taken out and shot at close point-blank range after the Battle of Coleto and after they had been prisoners for a week. The book, I'm happy to say, you'll pardon me for putting this in, won a prize. Not only the one from the Philosophical Society, but from the Western History Association. That's the good news. The bad news is that it won the Dwight L. Smith Prize for the best reference book about the history of the American West. What that means is it's too damn long to read. It's about 650 pages. It has 1,354 endnotes, but some of the endnotes are really good, and in one there's a hidden prize. If you can solve the puzzle and send the right answer in. What's this? There we go. This is that other book that Pamela mentioned, Sleuthing the Alamo. I put it in here because I first wrote about Ehrenberg and first in a book form and then linked it to the Davy Crockett story in this book that was published after I got a little more suave. Now, what did Ehrenberg say about those two battles, the Alamo and San Jacinto, that he didn't witness? This is a pretty good illustration, although it was done long after he wrote, but before he was published in English, of what happened to Davy Crockett. Here's the English translation of what he wrote. Only David Crockett and 6 other men were still fighting when the core of Santa Anna's troops came over the walls. I was curious to know what he meant by the core. He uses the term Kern in German, which means the core, the heart, the kernel, the bulk of Santa Anna's troops. But as you can see here, they all died anyway. They had a whole circle of corpses lying around them, but they fell too, struck down by the musket balls of the jubilant enemy. That's not how Davy Crockett died. This is what De La Pena saw. General Manuel Castrillon brought 7 prisoners to Santa Anna. Santa Anna was livid. He told him he never should have done that. He turned to the troops near him and said, "Shoot them." They didn't shoot. And instead, Santa Anna's own retinue came out and killed them with sword thrusts. This is not the Carmen Perry translation. It's my translation, which is accurate. Hers is not. They died moaning, but without humiliating themselves. What did he say about San Jacinto? He wasn't there either. Basically, he didn't understand where most of the Mexican retreating troops went as they went towards Peggy's Lake and ended up dying either in the lake or towards the lake or as they tried to get to the lake. He thought that they had followed Santa Anna's flight. Who followed Santa Anna's flight? The cavalry. The Mexican cavalry went in that direction, not the infantry. He just got that wrong. Now, to finish up, once again linking the Alamo and San Jacinto, which happens all the time by necessity. We're going to look at an anonymous witness to the Battle of San Jacinto. I don't have to tell you what this is. This is the McCardle Battle of San Jacinto that hangs in the Senate chamber of the Texas Capitol. Why have I emphasized the left side here? I want to focus in on the two sides clashing near the Mexican cannon. You can see the flag. You can see a Mexican officer shooting towards the Texans. Who was this? Manuel Castrillon. This picture was finished in 1895 after years of work by McCardle interviewing veterans from San Jacinto to get as much accuracy as possible into his picture, into his painting. Now let's look at that eyewitness. This is the Telegraph and Texas Register, published here in Houston in 1843. As you can see here, random sketches of the Revolution by an officer of the Army. And he jumps right into April 21st and the Battle of San Jacinto. Now look at this carefully. This is in the middle of his discussion. About this time, an officer was seen standing on the timber behind the cannon. That's the one that was put in. Now, What did I leave out when I just read that sentence? As Shakespeare said, "Is this a dagger which I see before me?" Do you see the dagger next to the word officer? What does that mean? It means there's a footnote coming. Here's the footnote. This officer, see the dagger again? This officer is more particularly noticed, as it was afterwards known he was the noble and generous Colonel Castrillon, who wished to save the life of Crockett at the fall of the Alamo. Castrillon himself died and was buried across the bayou by Lorenzo de Zavala, his old friend from Mexico. Let me end with this. There's not a lot of good coming out of Haiti these days. One of the best things ever to come out of Haiti was Michel Rolfe-Trouillot. English was his third language. As an upper-class Haitian, French was his first, Creole was his second, English was his third. He ended up teaching at United States universities and colleges. This is not an easy book, but it's a very important book, and he says something about the Alamo and San Jacinto. What does he say about San Jacinto? He says that he says that Santa Anna lost 2 battles on April 21st. What are the 2 battles that he lost? He lost the Battle of San Jacinto, but he lost the Battle of the Alamo too. Because if San Jacinto had turned out differently, we wouldn't be talking about the Alamo the way we do. The Alamo would mean something completely different and very diminutive compared to what it means today. The book Silencing the Past talks about how silences occur in history. At the time when people are killed or kept from talking, like Emily West, also known as the Yellow Rose of Texas, who was the wrong race, the wrong class, the wrong gender, to get her story out about what happened in the Texas Revolution. First happens at the time. Then it happens when the archives are done, when librarians put together the story. Winners write the history, and winners decide what goes into the archive. There are also little bits and pieces in the archives where the losers have their say. But when most people write their histories, they ignore them and silence them in that way. And finally, when readers who, like me, growing up in Texas in the 40s and 50s and 60s, learn myth instead of history, even the readers tend to silence what doesn't fit their image of what happened. They pass over it, they ignore it. That's human nature. So Trouillot has encouraged me through his books to try to dig out those hidden pieces, those voices from the past that have been passed over. And when you do that sometimes, you discover whole new stories that are actually more interesting than the myths we grew up with. Thank you for your attention.